Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. For the benefit of those joining us virtually and who do not know me, let me introduce myself. I'm Arrmanatha Nasir, Vice Chair of the Committee and Permanent Representative of Indonesia to the United Nations. I would like to thank all of you for your presence here today, physically. I also would like to thank those joining us on livecast through UNTV. The Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People convenes this panel at a time when the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people are experiencing one of the darkest chapters in their history, when their existence as people are being threatened. The war unleashed by Israel on Gaza is resulting in a devastating death toll of Palestinian civilians, mostly women and children. The number to date is over 18,000 killed. We are witnessing an exercise of collective punishment against civilians, a deliberate denial of access to food as well as other basics, life-saving humanitarian supplies. There is no protection for millions of civilians who are most affected by conflict. The forcible displacement of the population within Gaza, many of whom were already refugees. The systematic destruction of the Gaza Strip's home infrastructures, mosques, churches, hospitals, and public buildings, protected objects, all endanger the very presence of the Palestinian in their ancestral land. So much deliberate violence raises questions about the ultimate objective of this military operation and the crimes being seemingly perpetrated and broadcast live daily on our TV sets and social media. Additional questions pertain on the international community responsibility to address such ongoing crimes. This is why the committee believes it is pertinent to convene this panel, analyze what is taking place in Gaza, and discuss member states' responsibilities. Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, only a few days ago, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes of Genocides of 9 December 1948, ratified or exceeded by 153 states as of 2022. It is indeed the obligations and duty of member states to prevent this crime and implement the call, never again. Today, we will hear from international law and human rights experts, practitioners, and scholars on their views on the nature of the violations taking place in Gaza. And we will also focus on the responsibility of the international community. Before proceeding, I would like to reiterate that the committee is dedicated to promoting the inalienable right of the Palestinian people through the two-state solution, as called by UN resolutions, international law, and overwhelming majority of the international community, based on Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace, security, and with East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine. After the opening remark of Ambassador Feda, the Deputy Permanent Observers of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, Ambassador Hari Prabowo of Indonesia will continue to moderate this discussion today. I apologize, I will have to leave as the development with the preparation of today's 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly requires me to be in a number of meetings this morning, including those with the OIC and the Arab group. I now give the floor to Ambassador Feda to present her opening remarks.
Thank you, Ambassador Nasser, and our thanks to the committee for this timely decision to convene this regrettably necessary discussion. We welcome the esteemed panelists with us today, and we await to hear and learn from their important presentations. Mr. Chair, delegates, friends, though the State of Palestine acceded to the Genocide Convention along with other human rights covenants, we never envisaged the day we would be compelled to invoke it. We believed the international community's vow of never again, believed it was universal, and believed that the legal, humanitarian, political, moral, and human obligations towards the question of Palestine would be upheld, enabling the Palestinian people to realize their long-denied rights, justice, and freedom before ever reaching this point. Yet today we are living a nightmare, witnessing the unspeakable atrocities and crimes in occupied Palestine, and especially in the besieged Gaza Strip, being perpetrated by Israel and its occupying forces and settler militias, using almost every form of weaponry known to humankind and even threatening the most lethal, nuclear annihilation. Israel is traumatizing and terrorizing the Palestinian people, wantonly killing, maiming, and destroying at a pace unprecedented since World War II. This inhumane and catastrophic situation has led many, scholars, jurists, civil society, parliamentarians, governments, and global citizenry, to conclude that Israel is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide against the Palestinian people. As early as the 10th of October, we alerted the Security Council, General Assembly, and Secretary General of Israel's genocidal intent. After declaring its siege on Gaza, no food, no water, no fuel, no medicines, no essentials for human survival, and open threats to treat Palestinians as, quote, human animals, quote, to give them hell, quote, to turn Gaza into a deserted island, and calls for, quote, a Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 48. And after only 3 days of its brutal assaults by air, land, and sea against our defenseless civilians, the reality became painfully clear, and we warned in that October 10th letter, quote, such blatant dehumanization and attempts to bomb a people into submission, to use starvation as a method of warfare, and to eradicate their national existence are nothing less than genocidal. Since then, we have worked continually to mobilize collective action, including accountability measures, to stop this Israeli war on our people, a blatant extension of over 75 years of Nakba, 100 years of colonization since the Balfour Declaration and British Mandate over Palestine, and 56 years of a settler colonial occupation and apartheid regime bent on the oppression, dispossession, displacement, and ethnic cleansing of our people. And so it has become painfully ironic that at the very same time that the UN gathered on the 8th of December to commemorate 75 years of the Genocide Convention, we are addressing this issue. And on that day, rather than being at the commemoration, we were instead at the Security Council pleading for a halt to the bloodshed and for the prevention of genocide against our people. We have appealed to all countries and to the UN system in its entirety, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and its judicial organs, the ICC and ICJ, and to all humanitarian agencies, UNRWA at the forefront, to address all dimensions of this crisis. The most urgent action we seek now is a ceasefire, the minimum immediate step necessary to halt Israel's massacres of Palestinian children, women, and men in Gaza, and its violence in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to halt its attempts to forcibly transfer our people from their land. Just days ago, an overwhelming majority of countries urged the Security Council to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. But unfortunately, Israel was once again shielded by a U.S. veto, allowing this savage assault on our people to continue. Today, we are returning to the General Assembly in an emergency special session to press the same demand as an urgent priority to save human lives. And after today, we will continue, as before, all efforts to bring an end to Israel's genocidal aggression on Gaza, an end to its killing and maiming, ethnic cleansing, siege and deprivation, and collective punishment and persecution of the Palestinian people, and an end to its occupation, colonization, and annexation of their land. We will continue seeking protection for our people, accountability for the crimes perpetrated against them, and pursue all legitimate means for the attainment of justice and freedom. And so we remain grateful to the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and the Division for Palestinian Rights for their support, and to all countries and peoples who stand in solidarity with Palestine and act for justice and peace, including the extraordinary work of civil society. And with that, I close, Mr. Chair, and welcome again our panelists.
So if you give me a minute, we'll just switch the moderator.
You want to stay? Well done, Feda. Thank you. I came just a few minutes ago. See you. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Nasir, and thank you again, Ambassador Feda, and please rest assured of the committee's unwavering support for the Palestinian people. And I also wish to thank all the distinguished panelists who are here with us today. And we will now move to hear presentations from them, and then we will open the floor for Q&A and discussion. And I will firstly introduce our distinguished panelists for today. The first one is Mr. Jehad Abusalim, Executive Director of the Jerusalem Fund and its educational program, the Palestine Center. Jehad is completing his PhD in History, Hebrew, and Judaic Studies joint program at the New York University. His main area of research is Palestinian and Arab perceptions of the Zionist project and the Jewish question before 1948. He earned his bachelor's degree in business administration and Hebrew language from Al-Azhar University in Gaza. And then our next speaker is Mr. Segal, Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Endowed Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide at Stockton University. In addition to scholarly publications, Dr. Segal has published op-eds, book reviews, and larger articles on genocide, state violence, and memory politics in Hebrew, English, and German. Next speaker is Ms. Hannah Bruinsma, a legal advisor at the NGO Law for Palestine, which is accredited to the committee. She holds an LLM in Public International Law from Leiden University. Her experience is focused on international law, human rights advocacy, and Palestinian land rights. She's working on current developments in Israel and Palestine. And last but not least is Ms. Katherine Gallagher, a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. She works on universal jurisdiction and international criminal law cases involving US and foreign officials. She is also involved in civil actions involving private military corporations and torture at Abu Ghraib. In the past, she worked at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia from 2001 until 2006 as a legal advisor for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Kosovo and with the Special Court for Sierra Leone in Freetown. Now I would like to invite Mr. Jehad Abusalim to deliver his remarks. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable delegates, I speak to you today not just as an expert on the Gaza Strip, but also as someone who has lived there for most of his life. My family and friends are among the 2 million Palestinians enduring one of the most violent military assaults of this century. As of yesterday, the Euromed Human Rights Monitor estimates that more than 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by Israeli bombardment, including more than 9,000 children. This number includes those presumed dead under the rubble. Additionally, 48,000 have been injured and 1,840,000 have been displaced. A total of 53,000 homes have been completely destroyed and 172,000 units partially destroyed. Over 1,300 industrial facilities have also been destroyed. The numbers are staggering, and the scale of killing and destruction is beyond comprehension. However, ladies and gentlemen, this is not impossible to comprehend if we consider the longer context of Israel's approaches towards the Gaza Strip. The ongoing genocide in Gaza is part of a much deeper history of Israeli aggression against Palestinians as part of the broader context of Israel's violent settler colonialism and occupation of Palestinian land. This process began with the 1948 Nakba or catastrophe and continues today. In 1948, the State of Israel was established on 78% of mandatory Palestine. This moment was marked by violence and resulted in the destruction of significant parts of Palestinian existence. Through forced displacement and expulsion, Israel was established, leading to the expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. Palestinians lost land, property, resources, and the ability to live in dignity in their homeland. Many of their cultural, political, and spiritual institutions were destroyed. A process of erasure began, denying Palestinian existence and connection to the land, and preventing any form of Palestinian expression or realization of political aspirations. Understanding Gaza requires understanding the context of the Nakba and its continuation. The Nakba was not just an event in the distant past, it was a political, economic, geographic, and cultural rupture that disrupted Palestinian life and prevented Palestinians from realizing their potential in their homeland. The Nakba continues to unfold in Gaza today as a process of continuous displacement and ethnic cleansing. Before, during, and after Israel's establishment, the explicit goal of the Israeli enterprise has always been to create and sustain a Jewish demographic majority and deny Palestinians their rights. This is achieved through force and violence whose scale and intensity have fluctuated over the decades. This understanding is crucial. Due to the 1948 Nakba, the historic Gaza subdistrict was reduced from an area of 1,111 square kilometers to today's Gaza Strip, spanning only 365 square kilometers. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced or fled to the Gaza Strip, losing their communities, institutions, shops, trade, homes, orchards, cattle, personal belongings, and even their bank deposits. The residents of Gaza, displaced from their city and neighboring villages during the British conquest of Palestine during World War I, returned post-war. War and conquest aren't foreign to Palestine, but after every war and conquest, people return. However, in Gaza, as in other parts of Palestine and neighboring Arab countries, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians faced the harsh reality that their refugeehood would become permanent in 1948. In the 1950s, especially in the years immediately following the Nakba, conditions in the Gaza Strip were dire, with people suffering from starvation and disease, and the early refugee camps lacked the basic infrastructure necessary for maintaining life, health, and dignity. In response to the permanence of the conditions following the 1948 Nakba, thousands of Palestinian refugees in Gaza and elsewhere attempted to return to their homes, only to be met with Israeli violence, murder, arrest, and torture. Israel labeled these attempts at return and repatriation infiltration and responded with severe violence. This response gave rise to a Gazan question as part of a larger Palestinian question, a decades-long dilemma for Israeli leaders and policymakers on how to manage a region created by their actions, conquests, and the gambling with the lives of millions of Palestinians and Jews to establish their Jewish majority state in 1948. From the 1950s onwards, Israel's approach to Gaza centered on violence. In 1956 and 1957, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, killing, arresting, and torturing more than 1% of its population. The reoccupation in 1967 deepened the pain of the 1948 Nakba. Even though Israel allowed Palestinians to work in the Israeli market in limited industries, it suppressed Palestinian political expression, restricted cultural life, and embarked on a colonization project within the Gaza Strip. This involved taking over land, building settlements, and allowing Jewish settlers to move in. By 2005, 1.4 million Palestinians lived on 75% of the Gaza Strip. 8,000 Jewish settlers occupied the remaining 25%. The settlements in Gaza made life untenable, dividing the Strip with checkpoints and walls. Under Israel's occupation, the Gaza Strip underwent economic deterioration or de-development. Throughout the 1990s, even during the Oslo process, the Gaza Strip became more separated from the West Bank. Israel introduced military closures, restrictions, and a permit system that limited entry and exit from Gaza. This isolation severed Gaza's economy from the West Bank and separated families, preventing their reunification. By 2007, a land, air, and sea blockade was imposed, leading the United Nations to declare that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. We are now almost in 2024. When Gaza rebelled in the face of all of these atrocities, whether by armed or unarmed means, Israel always responded with extreme violence, and Israeli leaders always seemed indifferent to the fact that Gaza, like any other Palestinian community, is home to people part of a nation with unresolved questions of liberation, independence, and the right to live with dignity in their homeland. Every rebellion was met with severe violence through various strategies, including the infamous mowing the lawn strategy. They were also met with further colonization, closures, incursions, destruction of economic life, assassinations, mass bombardment campaigns, and the killing of civilians. The sophisticated and sadistic Israeli experiment of besieging and occasionally bombing Gaza has woven violence into every aspect of life there for decades. Violence has been a constant in people's daily lives and deaths. Living in Gaza has meant being engulfed by explicit, spectacular violence as we see today from bombardment and incursions, as well as more subtle forms of violence that have led people to use the term makhnoug, I'm suffocating, to describe their daily psychological and emotional state. Explaining the complexities of life in Gaza is a significant challenge, particularly to those outside of it. As someone who has written and spoken about Gaza for years, I recognize the difficulty in conveying the details, as most, especially in the West, cannot relate to them. Simple aspects of life, often taken for granted, are sources of daily struggle and anxiety in Gaza. These struggles are exhausting, depressing, and time-consuming, all due to Israel's abuse. Access to clean water, travel for medical treatment or education, electricity, lighting homes, treating sewage, exporting fruits and flowers, importing basic necessities, watching TV, that would be disrupted by drone signal interference, fishing, and harvesting crops. Each aspect is an exhausting ordeal. Every day in Gaza is another chapter in a story full of pain and dread, finding work, securing food. These are continuous struggle. Imagine generations born and raised amidst this dread, this violence that infiltrates every aspect of life, fostering a constant feeling of being on the verge of explosion. One day, ladies and gentlemen, the scale, depth, and cruelty of Israel's many experiments in Gaza might be fully grasped. Until then, atop the years of dread and suffocation, people in Gaza continue to be killed in droves. This is because Israel's approach to managing and controlling the lives of 2 million people through regulated violence has failed, and now they seek to reassert control through extreme violence and mass murder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jehad, and thank you for underlining that the horrible tragedy unfolding before us at the moment is not an isolated event, but part of a much longer context of violations against the rights of the Palestinian people and how injustices are happening on a daily basis to all Palestinians in Gaza and the whole part of the occupied Palestinian territory. And now I wish to invite the next speaker, Mr. Segal, to share his views and thoughts. Please, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. A few days ago, on 9th of December, a group of 56 senior scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence, who, like academics, disagree on much, all agreed on a statement on the mass violence in Israel and Palestine since 7th of October. I signed that statement as well. There is evidence, the scholars wrote, of, quote, a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack that the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines as a crime against humanity. Moreover, they added, dozens of statements of Israeli leaders, ministers in the war cabinet, and senior army officers since 7th of October, that is, people with command authority, suggest, quote, an intent to destroy Palestinians as such in the language of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We should take seriously the professional position and the warning of dozens of senior scholars who have devoted their lives to studying mass violence, including genocide. We should also take seriously, as they ask to do, what Israeli leaders have said since 7th of October, not only, as has been argued in the first week after the Hamas attack, the mass murder of 1,200 Israelis and migrant workers, and the taking of around 240 hostages, but repeatedly by different people with command authority using various rationalizations. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog used particularly loaded language in an interview on MSNBC just last week, for instance, on 5th of December, and I quote him, "This war is a war that is not only between Israel and Hamas," he said in response to a question about the high level of killings of Palestinians in Israel's attack on Gaza. This is already significant, an admission that the attack is not only against Hamas. It's a war, he continued, that is intended really, truly, to save Western civilization. We are attacked by a jihadist network, an empire of evil, and this empire wants to conquer the Middle East. And if it weren't for us, Europe would be next, and the United States follows. End of quote. Herzog builds on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's infamous association in late October and early November of Israel's attack on Gaza with a biblical story of Amalek. This is a story of the Israelites destroying completely an enemy perceived as the ultimate evil, Amalek. But Herzog places it on a modern scale as the last stand against global apocalypse and the demise, quote, of Western civilization. Herzog thus expressed a colonial rationalization of destruction of people under colonial occupation, but here taken to extreme. Israel's use of images and videos of the Hamas mass murder on 7th of October to justify its destructive assault on Gaza operates within this colonial framework. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant set the tone for this on 9th of October when he proclaimed, quote, total siege on Gaza in a fight against, in his words, human animals. If it remained unclear whether Gallant was describing only Hamas militants in this way or all Palestinians in Gaza, Israeli coordinator of government activities in the territories, Major General Hassan Aliyan, clarified it in the next day in his video message to the people of Gaza, and I quote him, Hamas has turned into ISIS, and the residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled, are celebrating. Human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell. So quite explicit and direct. Colonial attacks against colonized people assumed a war against, quote, savages, where laws of war between civilized people, that is, white Europeans, do not apply. This colonial common sense led to brutal and indeed genocidal counterinsurgency campaigns by colonial armies. This happened, for instance, when the German occupiers suppressed an uprising by the Herero in Southwest Africa from 1904 to 1907 through genocidal warfare. The German military commander there, General Lothar von Trotha, issued, quote, an extermination order and proceeded to implement it, so that by 1907, the German colonizers had killed 65,000 Herero, 80% of the population, together with 10,000 Nama. This practice of casting an entire civilian population as enemies, as legitimate military targets, is a common genocidal mechanism. Thus, Israeli President Herzog's words in a press conference on 13th of October that, quote, it is an entire nation out there, Palestinians in Gaza, that is responsible for the Hamas attack, that quote should have set off alarms. History is again instructive here. Hutu authorities in Rwanda, for example, identified all the Tutsis with the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the rebel Tutsi army that had invaded Rwanda from Uganda in 1990, which led to the Rwanda genocide in 1994. The Israeli authorities and the Israeli army have acted according to this genocidal intent in the last 2 months. This is the reason for the unprecedented level of mass killings. Now, with over 18,000 Palestinians that Israel's assault has killed in just a bit more than 2 months, with more than 7,000 of them children and youth, and of course thousands buried under the rubble, an unknown number, and we heard the data from Jehad. But, quote, killing members of the group and causing serious bodily or mental harm, the first 2 acts of genocide in the UN Genocide Convention, are not the only ones that Israel is perpetrating now in Gaza. It is the 3rd act of the convention, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, that mostly fits Israeli mass violence in Gaza now. The total siege measures, together with the forced displacement of over 1.8 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, have indeed created in the southern part of the Strip severe overcrowding with a risk of outbreak of infectious diseases exacerbated by acute shortages of food, clean water, fuel, and medical supplies. All along, moreover, the Israeli army pushes Palestinians into an increasingly shrinking area in what is to begin with one of the most densely populated areas in the world. We saw on 13th of October the, quote, evacuation order that Israel issued from the north to the south of Gaza, and now from the east to west, from Khan Yunis to Rafah, The Israeli army has also bombed Palestinians moving, fleeing to safe areas, or already in areas Israel designated as safe, so that, as one Palestinian put it in a post on social media on 1st of December, when Israel resumed its attack following the ceasefire, and I quote here, "We are left with one option, to accept death. It doesn't matter if we move or not, any minute now is our last. They say leave Khan Yunis for Rafah, then strike Rafah. We have nowhere to go. If we die, at least we die in the house, not out on the streets." Israeli Minister Avi Dichter, a member of the War Cabinet, described openly on Israeli TV the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza as, quote, the Gaza Nakba, referencing the mass deportations of 750,000 Palestinians during the 1948 war and the creation of Israel, which also included massacres and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns. Forced displacement, what is more commonly called ethnic cleansing, is not in itself an act of genocide, but we know that historically it has figured in genocidal processes. Indeed, a process of pushing unwanted people into designated areas that eventually escalated into genocide characterized the Holocaust. It took the Nazis 2.5 years into the war of experimenting with various schemes of forced displacement of Jews from fall 1939 to spring 1942 to reach the final version of, quote, the final solution of the Jewish question. It is also important to mention the language we are hearing in Israel about deporting Palestinians in Gaza to the Sinai Desert. This is now a common idea in Israeli politics and society. This was laid out first in a document prepared by the Israeli Intelligence Ministry on 13th of October, and it was articulated by various politicians and ministers, such as Dichter's comments on the Gaza Nakba. Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu's version from 5th of November is particularly noteworthy. He repeated Israeli President Herzog's rationale that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, that Palestinians in Gaza are actually, in his words, Nazis and monsters, and that they, quote, can go to Ireland or deserts. This is extremely alarming, as deserts have been used historically as weapons of genocide. For instance, when the German colonial occupiers in German Southwest Africa, which I mentioned, chased the Herero and Nama into the desert, where they died en masse from hunger and dehydration. The idea to remove all the Palestinians in Gaza explains why Israel's attack there targets everything, including universities, schools, hospitals, mosques, churches, and also, importantly, bakeries and agricultural fields. This very much fits the total siege aim of creating severe food insecurity, malnutrition, and hunger conditions for Palestinians in Gaza. The bombing of agricultural fields also demonstrates that Israel does not intend for Palestinians to be able to return to live in Gaza. A recent video that circulated widely on social media, created by Israeli soldiers in the Sajaiya neighborhood in Gaza on Friday, 8th of December, shows them setting fire to a truck with food and water in it. How they describe what they are doing is horribly revealing, and I quote the soldiers. "It is the second candle of Hanukkah. We are in a factory of candy that is given to children who carry out terror attacks. We are bringing the light to this dark place, burning it until there remains no remnant of it." It is not at all by coincidence that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a message to Israelis 3 days earlier, on 5th of December, that, quote, "This week we will light the first candle of Hanukkah. Our soldiers will bring light to the darkness in the alleyways of Gaza, in the ruins of Sajaiya, in the terrorist lairs in Khan Yunis. The lights together as a great light will cleave the darkness." But these soldiers could take inspiration from the widespread incitement to genocide in Israeli media, politics, and public spaces from the 7th of October. They have very likely heard members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, call, quote, "to burn Gaza now completely no less, as the ruling Likud party member Nissim Vatouri did on social media on 17th of November. And they have most probably heard politicians reaffirm Israeli President Herzog that, quote, there are no innocent people in Gaza, including the 1.1 people who are children and youth there, as Knesset member Avigdor Lieberman did on social media on 1st of December. They may have also read Israeli journalist David Mizrahi Wertheim, who wrote on social media on 7th of October that, and I quote, if all the captives are not returned immediately, turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. If a hair falls from their head, execute security prisoners. Violate all norms on the way to victory. Wertheim also added, we are fighting human animals. That was 2 days before Gallant used it in his total siege proclamation. 4 days later, another Israeli journalist, Roy Sharon, commented on social media, quote, that if in order to finally eliminate the military capabilities of Hamas, we need 1 million bodies, then let there be 1 million bodies. That is yet an example of how the slippage between targeting Hamas and targeting Palestinians is expressed. Annihilatory language has also appeared in public spaces in Israel, such as banners on the bridges in Tel Aviv that call, quote, to annihilate Gaza and explain that, quote, the picture of triumph is 0 people in Gaza. There are dozens and dozens of examples of incitement in Israeli media, which recalls the media incitement to genocide in Rwanda as genocide was unfolding there in 1994, which led, it is worth reminding everyone, to the media case when journalists were put on trial and convicted in the ICTR, the post-genocide trials, of incitement to genocide, which is a separate crime under Article 3 of the UN Genocide Convention. Genocide, then, has become normalized in Israeli media, society, and politics today. State leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers proclaim their intent openly to a society that is receptive and even encouraging. And the soldiers and officers in the Israeli army understand this very well. For them, too, there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. Palestinian children are terrorists, and the Israeli army needs to, quote, burn Gaza until no remnant remains of it. The 56 scholars of the Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence who signed the statement on 9th of December wrote that, quote, the time for concerted action to prevent genocide is now, warning also that, quote, should the Israeli attack continue, Palestinians under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Palestinian citizens of Israel face grave danger as well. It is our urgent responsibility and is the obligation of states under Article 1 of the UN Genocide Convention to heed this warning and act now to stop and prevent genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raj, for calling a spade that there is a clear evidence of widespread and systemic attacks in so many forms that constitute a genocide, that genocide is indeed taking place. And now I wish to turn to our next speaker, Ms. Hannah Bruinsma, to share her perspective. You have the floor. Thank you.
I want to start with say how important it is that we have this conversation here today, because those who are speaking out against the crime of genocide are under attack. Human rights activists, scholars, they're facing the threat of being fired, of being silenced, or even being killed. And this is not only happening in the occupied Palestinian territory. This is also happening in Europe and here in the US. So therefore, I'm so grateful that we're all here together today to speak on this topic and to address this issue. I'm here on behalf of Law for Palestine to talk about the situation through the lens of international law framework and on the crime of genocide. And to speak on the failure of the international community to hold Israel accountable for 75-year-long settler colonial regime, its 56-year illegal occupation of Palestinian territory, and its 16-year-long siege of the Gaza Strip. Its impunity over decades of international crimes, including crime of apartheid, has accumulated in the past months of horrific violence, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and a crime of genocide. Now all conducted with impunity. Because it should be clear, based on the legal research that Law for Palestine has conducted, what we're witnessing now is a crime of genocide. The indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian people, medical service not being able to respond to the people who are still trapped under the rubble, and we have lost connection with most of our colleagues in Gaza. Some of them have lost their houses, their family members, and it is with pain to say that we don't know if any of them are still alive. And this is happening at a moment when the UN Security Council is failing to take action and failing to call for a ceasefire. A ceasefire which is crucial in this time to end the suffering and to stop the crime of genocide from happening. So on the crime of genocide. Genocide requires both the intent and the act to happen. And as Dr. Segal already mentioned, it's written in the Genocide Convention that the key actions, the actus reus, include the killing of individuals, the inflicting of serious physical and psychological harm on them, and the intentionally creating living conditions designed to destroy the group, either whole or in part. And according to our legal research, and comparing them with the facts on the ground, we have come to the conclusion that Israel is deliberately inflicting these three conditions on the Palestinian people. Based on the collected evidence, Israel continues to target civilians indiscriminately and targeting civilian infrastructure, including hospitals. But genocide is not only the physical act, but also the intent to destroy. Usually the intent to destroy is the most difficult part to prove because you really have the intent to destroy in whole or in part a particular group. But in this case, as Ras already mentioned, the intent by the Israeli leaders has been very explicit. By the Prime Minister, by the President, by senior cabinet members, and by military leaders. These statements clearly constitute the mens rea, the mental element of the crime of genocide, and demonstrate our knowledge of the acts that are being committed. Law for Palestine has been working since the 7th of October to create a comprehensive database of genocidal statements by public officials, including the ones that Ras already mentioned. We've collected so far over 500 statements that demonstrate this intent, often of those who are in the chain of command. And these statements include the deliberate decivilization of civilians by equating them with combatants. According to our legal experts, these statements also cover the actus reus of the crime of genocide, such as statements on the cutting of electricity, internet, fuel, and the targeting of journalists, with the goal of exterminating civilians. Raphael Lemkins, the author of the Genocide, has written that the crime of genocide is not limited to the acts of mass killing, but must encompass a coordinated plan, aimed at destructing the essential foundations of the lives of the national and ethnic group. In Gaza, we've seen explicit evidence of Israel's plan and its continued execution of this plan. An example of this is Israel's 70-year-old Dahiya doctrine, a military strategy of disproportionate force to weaken the population to a point where mere survival supersedes resistance. For the past 8 weeks, we've seen this doctrine into force, including Israel's announcement of a total siege of Gaza, the systematically and deliberately denying of life-saving resources, including food, water, electricity, fuel, to the entire population of Palestinian population in Gaza. It has come to the point where the UN World Food Programme has stated that households in northern Gaza are experiencing alarming levels of hunger. At least 97% of the households in northern Gaza have inadequate food consumption, with 9 out of 10 people, 9 out of 10, going on 1 full day and 1 full night without food. The Genocide Convention has 152 signatories as of date, meaning that 152 members recognize the importance of preventing the crime of genocide from happening. Since its inception in 1948, it has become customary international law, which has also been reiterated by the ICJ on numerous occasions. So this means that not only 152 signatory states are obliged to comply with the convention, but that all member states of the international community are obliged to comply. Further, the ICJ prohibition on the crime of genocide constitutes a US COGAS norms. This means that it cannot be derogated from, under no justification and no circumstances. But it's necessary for us to remember that the crime of genocide is part of a century-long injustices that the Palestinians face, across the territory and in the diaspora. According to many Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations, Palestinians face structural discrimination, including crime of apartheid, discriminatory laws, settler violence in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, house demolition, destruction of villages and forced evictions, and the detention of thousands of Palestinians without a charge, often on the basis of administrative detention. All these elements make Palestinian daily life a struggle. And therefore, our actions shouldn't stop with stopping the crime of genocide, but also with upholding the Palestinian right to self-determination. Because multiple UN General Assembly and UN Security Resolutions have reiterated this right, and also outlined in the mandate of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People that's hosting today's event, that the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination is inalienable. At Law for Palestine, my colleagues have worked tirelessly, often at personal risk for those in the occupied Palestinian territories, to compile evidence and to engage with states, demanding a more robust actions taken against these crimes. However, evidently, this is not the responsibility of civil society organizations. It's obligatory on all members of the international community to build a case against the perpetrators of this crime of genocide and to see that they're brought to justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you for your insights on the legal framework of the crime of genocide. And if I can conclude, that Israel has indeed met the legal requirements of conducting of genocide. Both the act and intent are clear, and it's been taking place with impunity, and that it's part of centuries-long injustices faced by the Palestinian people. So that is how grave the situation we are facing. Now I am handing over the floor to Ms. Katherine Gallagher, our next speaker. Ms. Gallagher, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the committee for inviting me. It is an honor to be on this panel, though I wish we were not here discussing what we are. And I particularly want to acknowledge and appreciate Jehad for bringing Gaza into the room for us today to make this legal conversation real and understand the urgency, which I hope all of the member states in this room hear today. So I'm going to pick up where Hannah left off. Hannah and Raz, and indeed Jehad, outlined how the facts and the law satisfy the legal requirements for genocide. And we have institutions that can carry forward then the obligations to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. I won't speak about the International Criminal Court. I know that there are individuals, member states in this room right now who are also following the proceedings of the Assembly of States Parties, and I would urge you to take what you hear in this room also into conversations about the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor has the ability at this moment to issue arrest warrants to those who are committing and those who are aiding and abetting the crime of genocide. But I will focus here on the responsibility of states and the potential around the International Court of Justice. But I do think it is important to remember that we have numerous institutions at the international level and, of course, also have national courts. And as Hannah said, the crime of genocide is one that is customary international law. It is an obligation of all states to take all measures, including the punishment of those who are committing genocide, as well as measures, as I will discuss, to prevent the commission, and that includes stopping arms transfers and punishing those states and individuals who are making such transfers. So we have the ability to do something now to save human lives, as was said, if we give effect to this legal framework. So to recap, as Hannah said and Raz outlined in great detail, we have statements by Israeli officials expressing their intent to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinian population in Gaza. Those statements started as soon as October 7th, but by October 9th, when we had the proclamation of the total siege against, quote, human animals of no food, no electricity, no fuel, we understood that we were looking at a situation of total siege. On October 10th, the spokesperson for the IDF made the statement that, quote, the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. And on October 13th, the Israeli President Herzog said, quote, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. I urge member states to look at these statements as not mere rhetoric, but as admissions of criminal intent. And what we have seen in the days since, the early days, we are now 2 months into this horrific attack on the Palestinian population in Gaza. What we have seen there is that those statements have been given effect. Israeli officials said what they mean and have done what they said they would do. We've seen a total siege that has resulted in now children dying, a medical infrastructure that is decimated, and an op-ed today that laid out by the leaders of the top 5 humanitarian organizations, a humanitarian crisis of which they've said they've never seen such a scale so quickly. And I think it's important as we hear these words, humanitarian crisis, to realize that this is human-made. This is not something that would exist but for the total siege, the quote-unquote evacuation of 1.8 million people, the forced displacement of 1.8 million people, and that near constant bombardment now for over 65 days. So we have the intent and we have the actions of genocide. Again, the 3 underlying acts here: killing, serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. When we look at what the elements of genocide are, and especially this creation of conditions of life to destroy the group in whole or in part, you do not have to achieve that goal, thankfully, to actually have committed genocide. And likewise, with killing, I think there is a popular understanding that we are talking about the destruction, the killing of an entire group of people. We have seen genocide found with the killing of over 7,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys in the context of Srebrenica. That is genocide. So I think to have a number in your head is the wrong way to approach understanding what the crime of genocide is. It is, again, that intent coupled with actions. And when you look at the elements of the International Criminal Court unpacking the conditions of life, it is, quote, the deliberate deprivation of resources indispensable for survival, such as food or medical services, or systematic expulsion from homes. The case law of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in the case against Radovan Karadzic, a name known in these halls, as well as another case looking at Srebrenica, said that creating the circumstances that would lead to a slow death as the lack of proper food, water, shelter, clothing, or sanitation are underlying acts of genocide. And again, the length of time that members of this group were subjected to them and the characteristics of the groups such as vulnerability are illustrative factors to be considered in evaluating the criterion of probability. And in this regard, I think it is very important to remember the context that Jehad laid out of the situation in Gaza on October 6th. The fact that this was a closed-off area that had already been subjected to 16 years of blockade and multiple military assaults by Israel in the prior decade. So we have a vulnerable population when the total siege was instituted. What does this mean then for member states? Let's go back to the Genocide Convention. It is the Genocide Convention to prevent or punish genocide. And Article 1 lays out clearly that there is a legal duty on states to take all measures that they can to prevent genocide. The International Court of Justice has had the occasion repeatedly, unfortunately, in the last 15 years to look at this duty to prevent. In cases of Bosnia versus Serbia, in Croatia versus Serbia, in the case of Gambia versus Myanmar regarding the Rohingya genocide, and in a recent case, Ukraine versus Russia. So there is ample jurisprudence out there that makes clear that from the moment a country, quote, learns of or should have learned of the existence of the serious risk of genocide, the duty to prevent is activated. So when we look back to those first days in October, the statements of the total siege, the promise to destroy, quote, human animals, we already, all of us, have been on notice of the serious risk of genocide. And that means member states have already been obligated to take all measures within their power to prevent genocide. This obligation is heightened when a state has the ability to influence or, quote, affect those suspected of preparing genocide or reasonably suspected of harboring specific intent. All states, again, have the duty to do what they can, but those who have the direct ability to influence, such as those states who are giving political cover, those states who are providing arms, those states who are giving economic assistance even before October 6th, they have the ability to influence the conduct of Israel. And as I will go on and explain, when those states continue to provide support and assistance, they cross the line from not only breaching their obligation, their duty to prevent, their legal obligation, they actually cross over to arguably aiding and abetting or complicity in genocide. So the International Court of Justice in the situation of Gambia v. Myanmar, the Rohingya genocide, when it
Excuse me. If I just briefly interrupt with a technical announcement, there is interpretation available in different languages for those who require interpretation. We were actually not planning to have interpretation, but the interpreters have showed up. So thank you very much for all the interpreters for your dedication to this event. I'm sorry. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you. Just to quickly lay out, the International Court of Justice has been seized in other cases regarding the duty to prevent genocide. In the case of Gambia v. Myanmar, it issued provisional measures to ensure compliance with the convention, including the duty to prevent, when it found that breaches of the convention are, quote, plausible. I think it is really important to understand the burden here. It is not that you have to prove that genocide is being committed. It's not that you have to lay out a criminal case at this point. What you need to show is that there is a serious risk that genocide will be or is being committed and that states that have the ability to use influence to prevent this genocide have not done so. That is all. And so I think here we are now in December, and it is regrettable that we are not yet seeing the same action at the International Court of Justice in the situation of the unfolding genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza that we have seen in other situations. We have been warned from many corners. If you need to see where these triggers of warning have come, they've come from UN officials. They have come, as Ross pointed out, from historians. They've come from civil society. And we have not seen states heed that warning. I'm going to speak now about the United States. The United States is the largest provider of military, economic, and political assistance, and I would argue political cover, that has the ability to use its considerable influence and unique position to take all measures to stop Israel's unfolding genocide. Of course, the United States is not the only country that has such influence and such ability. Instead, though, the United States at every opportunity has done the opposite. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin have all pledged and continue to pledge all support to Israel. They have rushed military support, ammunition, precision-guided munitions, 2,000-pound bunker bombs, and they've been flying drones overhead. Their U.S. military advisors have been in war cabinet sessions. And on top of the already $3.8 billion that the United States provides to Israel this year in military assistance, it is seeking an additional $14.5 billion without conditions, as has been repeatedly said by U.S. officials, including in repeated press conferences when asked. There are, quote, no red lines for conditions for these weapons. And as the Washington Post reported yesterday, quote, Israel has dropped more than 22,000 guided and unguided bombs on Israel supplied by Washington. And then here in the United Nations, we saw already on Friday that the United States vetoed the resolution for a ceasefire. What we saw during the humanitarian pause is that a ceasefire will save lives. Also on Friday, as the U.S. vetoed that resolution, it bypassed Congress to rush yet more weapons to Israel. And this is against a death toll of at least 17,000, including at least 7,000 children, and again, an ongoing total siege, which in and of itself constitutes an underlying act of genocide. This additional $10 million in tank ammunitions have now been rushed to Israel. And we've seen what the tanks are doing in Gaza. We've seen what they are attacking: civilian infrastructure, civilian homes, civilian lives. So I would argue that the United States has crossed the line to complicity. As we saw in the Akayesu trial judgment out of the Rwandan tribunal and the Musama case, complicity includes procuring and sending weapons. Providing weapons or other instruments and means used in the commission of genocide, knowing that they would be used for that purpose, is complicity in genocide. It is important to emphasize here that for complicity or aiding and abetting, the complicit individual or state need not share the specific intent to commit genocide. What it needs to do is know that the committer has that specific intent, i.e., those statements that we heard from Israeli officials laying out their intentions regarding the Palestinian population in Gaza already, again, 2 months ago. My organization, the Center for Constitutional Rights, has the privilege, though again, it is not a privilege that we want, to have filed a case on behalf of Defense for Children International Palestine, El Haq, and 8 Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinian Americans against President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin here in the United States in federal court in California. We charged them with 2 counts, their failure in the duty to prevent genocide and complicity in genocide. The United States on Friday, as it was vetoing the Security Council resolution and announcing the additional tank munitions, it also filed its response in our case. It is seeking to not be held legally accountable, with some legal arguments around separation of powers, saying that its actions shouldn't be reviewed by a court. It's notable that it also said that it can't be held liable for the actions that our clients face, for the harms that they endure, because they say Israel is a, quote, independent actor. We will be filing our response next Friday, and we will be laying out the many ways that what is happening in Gaza cannot and would not be happening without U.S. material support and political cover. Our case was supported by an expert declaration by William Shabas, who is probably known to many of you in the international criminal law field. He concluded already on November 9th that the United States has, in fact, breached its obligation to prevent. So once again, I would urge member states to consider legal remedies at the international level for this duty to prevent. Our case was also supported by historians who placed the intent and the underlying acts in a historical context. We need action now. Please take action to stop the unfolding genocide against the Palestinian people and to give true meaning to the responsibility to prevent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for your passionate call and for underlining on the responsibility of state, obligation of all states to take all measures to prevent and stop genocide. And this afternoon, all member states of the United Nations actually will have that opportunity to choose what is right, to choose humanity over narrow politics, to vote for humanity rather than to debate which words should be included in the text. So I hope this afternoon we will all vote for humanity. Now, I now wish to open the floor for the discussion. I would like to invite member states first and then others to share your questions, your views to the panelists. Please inform us of your name and the country or institution that you represent. Now I open the floor for any colleagues who wish to raise any views. So I guess while waiting for any intervention, I wish to trigger the discussion by asking 2 questions to the panelists. One is, which concrete actions can member states and the UN take to prevent the crime from occurring? Of course, Katherine has elaborated on that earlier, but I also would like to seek views from other panelists as well. And second is, which accountability mechanism can be triggered at the ICC or ICJ, such as emergency requests or other actions. And this, of course, relates to one important point raised during the discussion about impunity. So perhaps we can go from Raj and then Hannes and then the rest of the panelists. Please, thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is you're asking about actions of nation states in the international legal framework, so maybe we start with the international lawyers and Katie and Hannah.
Please. So perhaps Katherine first, and then Hannah, or?
So you can go first, Katie.
Yes, just to maybe pick up where I left off, I think the first thing that member states need to do is not be afraid of the word genocide. It is, of course, an incredibly serious crime. I don't use this word lightly, and we did not file our case without feeling that, unfortunately, the facts met the law. But to then understand the urgency and the requirement in the Genocide Convention to actually take measures to prevent. So I think the most concrete thing that we can see to give meaning to that is to go to the International Court of Justice seeking precautionary measures and to get some urgent orders out there for states to stop sending the weapons. Unfortunately, one of the things we learned about the humanitarian pause is this was not only a moment where Palestinians in Gaza could get some much-needed humanitarian support and a slight reprieve from the constant bombing, but it was also an opportunity for Israel to rearm and re-up its weapon supply. So we need states to stop sending weapons. They are on notice at this moment of how those weapons are being used and who they are being used against. So I think the transfer of weapons is something that I would also highlight as what needs to be stopped.
Thank you. And then Hannah?
Yes, with Love for Palestine, we're working to use these 500 statements that we have collected to, together with our legal research we've done, to publish it at the ICC, as we believe this is a crucial mechanism to use. And in the coming weeks, we will publish this, and then also more about the details of this legal analysis will be published. But I think it's very important that we're starting this conversation here today and that we're talking about the crime of genocide, and that these statements that are used are also are a result of different civil society organizations working together to collect this evidence. And I think Love for Palestine is aware of the challenges that are also there with the ICC, but we're looking forward to publish our full legal research in the coming weeks.
Thank you. And perhaps to Jehad and Raj, do you think the international community has done enough? And, what more can the international community do, to bring this cause? Please.
Thank you. I think that a key issue is that there needs to be an end to the impunity across the board that Israel has enjoyed among the international community and the international legal framework for decades. And it's a very strange impunity because, of course, it's in the face of incredible evidence of violations of international law, of various sorts of forms of mass violence, of the reality of decades of military occupation, of siege. Now, this impunity has, of course, various kinds of reasons, and we can go into that perhaps. But I would say that now, when we're again witnessing all of us this unfolding genocidal assault for more than 2 months now, right, with really unprecedented levels of killing in such a short period of time and destruction that we're all seeing, and the use of various sorts of weapons that were mentioned here, and clear and explicit and direct statements of intent, right? And it's worth mentioning that the issue of intent in the Genocide Convention, of course, is a very high bar because it's usually very difficult to prove intent, right? Because perpetrators don't go around expressing their intent in such clear and direct and explicit ways. But here they are, for various reasons, again, and I think it's very much rooted in the colonial framework that I mentioned, right? So we have clear, direct, and explicit proclamations of intent. It's all in front of our eyes. Decades-long impunity of Israel has to end. It has to end for the sake of stopping this unfolding violence. Also, we can also maybe later address the need for prevention of possible escalations in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the dangers that Israeli Palestinians face. But one last point that's worth mentioning here is that impunity has to end because really the whole world now is watching. And if now again the international legal system will fail, the implications for persecuted and marginalized groups around the world could be very, very dire.
And to add to what Raz has said, I think there has to be a moment of reflection with regards to how the international community allowed Israel to get away with imposing one of the longest cases of siege and blockade on a population in the century. I mean, even before this genocide ensued, if you look at statements by Israeli officials or Israeli politicians who would play a role in this coalition government or the ones that came before, they were casually talking about different solutions for Gaza, including sending them to Canada or to Europe, and they were experimenting. I mean, I talked a little bit about that in my talk, between counting the calories for how much food to enter Gaza so that there is a crisis, but it's not bad enough to create a catastrophe, or managing this really brutal blockade that has rendered more than 2 million people isolated from the rest of the world, unable to access medical treatment, unable to travel, unable to secure basic necessities. So this experiment of blockading an entire population is a very dangerous precedent, that a state can get away with creating this reality. And then I think this is where the international community failed. It was normalized. It was normalized, and then we forgot about Gaza, and Gaza was forgotten. And unfortunately, we are reminded of all the challenges that have faced Gaza over the past decades through the worst ways possible. So I think, you know, the international community needs to reflect on the dangers of states being allowed to conduct such practices, the large-scale blockading and control and oppression of large numbers of people, like what happened in Gaza. And also, the blockade cannot continue. There can't be a blockade on Gaza after this, because we need decades to rebuild. I mean, Israel is after the very foundations of society. We're talking about schools, universities, cultural institutions, hospitals, entire neighborhoods, the entirety of the infrastructure that makes Gaza a livable place, that makes Gaza a place where human life can be sustained. And this cannot be rebuilt, and the people in Gaza cannot heal without an end for the blockade.
Thank you very much, Jehad. Now, I wish to again offer the floor if anyone wishes to raise their views. Oh, yes, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm David Wildman. I'm co-chair of the NGO Working Group on Israel-Palestine, and so I want to thank the whole panel and the committee for this really important and urgent, timely discussion on preventing genocide. I guess my question is, I heard from Katherine Gallagher about the lawsuit of the need for stopping arms transfers. And I know there's some constraints within the UN system, but I would love to hear both from the panelists, but I'd also invite, if there are members of the committee, of the steps 40 years ago, the UN General Assembly called for an arms embargo on Israel. It was not binding, but it put the call out there. And I would really wonder, love to hear from member states as well as from the panelists of steps about stopping arms transfers, at least calling for that publicly as the UN. And then secondly, also diplomatic restrictions. Several member states of the UN have in fact recalled ambassadors, but I'm wondering if there's something to mobilize the international community at this urgent moment when so many lives are on the line in Gaza and the risk to the West Bank, that at least calling for these actions of an arms embargo and diplomatic restrictions are something the UN General Assembly, the committee here, could take up in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Do we have any other requests for... Oh, yes, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Iqbal from the Mission of Indonesia. I think first I would like to thank the committee for holding this very important event, as well as the panelists for sharing their insightful comments. I think I would like to build upon the comments or questions made earlier concerning the arms embargo. I think if we reflect at the Arms Trade Treaty, where I think some of the major exporters of weaponries are actually part of and also already ratified the treaty, and it's in Article 6. It has a strict prohibition of prohibiting transfers to countries where it is clear that it has knowledge at the time that it will be authorized for the use of arms to commit the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, and even grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1949, as well as the attacks to civilian objects. So I think we have the frameworks already. Now is the question of how to implement and enforce that. So that's number one. And I think the questions that I wish to raise to the panel is whether also the role of the national courts in trying to pressure the perpetrators by producing perhaps an arrest warrant, which perhaps in a sense that it may be difficult to enforce, but also putting a political pressure to stop these abhorrent crimes. And also I would like to ask for the views of the panelists on whether the ICJ advisory opinion case that will be heard in February of next year, and how would this contribute to prohibiting or to at least give clarity to the legal consequences of third parties of the states and of other states, and also the international community with regards to the practices of Israel in Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And if I may take a follow-up question from the last question on ICJ advisory opinion. I'm not an expert on international law and the procedure of the ICJ, but I want to take advantage of having two international lawyers here. How the ongoing process at the ICJ could connect with what's going on the ground, considering that, for instance, the deadline for written submission has already passed last July, before these atrocities happen. So we have had several questions on more elaboration on the lawsuit, how to mobilize international community to be more forthcoming in preventing further atrocities, on how to make sure arms embargo can be effectively implemented, on the role of national court, and on the ICJ advisory opinion. So I wish to call all the panelists, perhaps can take turn to answer questions relevant to them. Perhaps this time around, because you started before, so perhaps we can start from this side at the moment. So please, thank you.
Well, I can't really refer to the procedures in the ICJ, and I don't deal with these kinds of issues. But I would like to maybe just add to the urgency of all of this, also on the international legal level, by again, also what you mentioned, David, the danger, I would actually say the acute danger that Palestinians also in the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem and Israeli Palestinian citizens of Israel face here. Because if we think indeed of the incredible and unprecedented incitement to genocide that we're seeing, as I mentioned, in Israeli media, politics, in public spaces, if we recognize that Palestinian citizens of Israel historically, so the 156,000 Palestinians who survived the Nakba and managed to remain within what became Israel in 1948, they were immediately put under military rule until 1966. So they were immediately seen as potential or real enemies. So we have the construction of Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but Palestinians anywhere under Israeli control in this image of enemies. We have Israeli Minister of National Security, who's a settler, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's distributed thousands and thousands of weapons to civilians, to Israeli Jewish civilians in the West Bank and within Israel, right? And set up hundreds of new, quote, self-defense units within Israel and the West Bank. Of course, the incredible intensification of Israel ethnic cleansing in the West Bank since the 7th of October, but in general, 2023 was the most lethal year since 2005 for Palestinians in the West Bank. And actually every year, right, in the last several years, broke new records of Israeli violence and brutality in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. If we think about legal frameworks in Israel, like the 2008 Jewish nation state law, a basic law. As we know, Israel doesn't have a constitution, so basic laws replace the constitution. This law actually cast Israeli Palestinian citizens of Israel legally as second-class citizens in an explicit framework of settler colonialism, right? And then we should remember also what happened in May 2021 when Israeli Palestinians came out in support of an Israeli attack in East Jerusalem, in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, and yet another attack on Gaza, and were met with incredible brutality and violence by the Israeli police. But in May 2021, also Jewish citizens joined actually the Israeli police in attacking Palestinians, and in some cases, as in Haifa, even broke into Palestinian homes and attacked them there. So the discussion about what should happen on the international legal level, on the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court here in the UN, right, should take into account the not only the normative framework in the UN Genocide Convention of punishment, but also really prevention. So not, I mean, of course, stopping the violence right now, which is incredibly urgent, but preventing the genocidal danger that Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israeli Palestinians now face.
Thank you. Next, Hannah, please.
Yes, as I shared before, the crime of genocide is an erga omnes norm, and it means that all states can, on the basis of their national jurisdiction, apply the universal jurisdiction. So I think it's incredibly important that on a national level, as you've been seeing happening in a lot of countries, for example, also in the Netherlands, where I'm from, is that national organizations are creating these cases to hold countries accountable for example, their delivery of arms to Israel. And I think this is not only a legally a very important method to use, but also a way to put pressure on national countries to hold them accountable for being complicit in these crimes of genocide. And therefore, I think it's very important as a method that is being used now to use these national cases to apply these erga omnes norms and to use the universal jurisdiction that many countries have to hold them accountable for these international crimes.
Thank you. And then Jehad. Please, Katherine.
just to pick up maybe on the first question around arms transfers and other means to try and make clear the international community's abhorrence with the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Certainly, I think the legal framework makes clear that states are aiding and abetting multiple violations of international law, including, of course, the Geneva Conventions, by continuing to send arms, knowing with the knowledge of how those arms are being used to target directly or indirectly the civilian population. So I do think picking up a resolution or committees that have the power to put in place bans on arms transfers is urgently needed. When it comes to larger sanctions against the State of Israel, I think that must also be considered. And here I make reference to the long campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but specifically sanctions in relation to what is happening on the ground in Gaza. And when it comes to visas, I think it's notable that to the extent the United States, for example, put out a notice last week of certain individuals being banned because of settler violence, the United States failed to condemn the settlements themselves. We need to look at the state policies and not just around the edges at some of the more extremist actors, because they are acting with state backing and in support of unlawful settlement enterprises. So to the extent that there are visa regimes that are instituted to ban people from traveling, it really needs to be aimed at those who bear the greatest responsibility for the most serious crimes. I am not saying that others, like those who are instituting settler violence, should not be getting visa bans, but it really needs to go at a much higher level. When it comes to national courts, the action that we did in our case is a civil action, because in the United States, we don't have the same ability as other countries to institute a criminal procedure. And I think it is also somewhat unfair in this moment to ask Palestinian victims to not only be enduring what they are with this unfolding genocide, but also to be the ones who are pursuing all measures of justice, to come forward and press these cases. We should have prosecutors doing their job at the national level, and again, I would say at the international level. So there can be cases, but those will largely, I fear, be only the result of civil society and victims themselves demanding justice. Please let us have some justice coming from the top, from states. And here, just to recall that there are now 124 member states of the International Criminal Court, and all of those states have both the legal frameworks in place to investigate and prosecute crimes of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and they also have the obligation to cooperate with the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who has an open investigation into the situation of Palestine. And so that means sharing information for those countries that might be in those War Council meetings with Israeli officials, but you don't have to be that close. For those who are flying drones or who have other intelligence information, to make clear that they will not cooperate with Israel, but rather will cooperate with the investigations. I think we need to see that now. And lastly, on the International Court of Justice case that's currently pending regarding the occupation, I think that that is an important case, and I'm glad that the General Assembly sought that advisory opinion. But the hearing is in February, and every single day that there is delay, more lives are lost. Lives of prominent Palestinians in Gaza, like Dr. Rafat, a mentor to so many, and to unknown Palestinian children, elderly, men and women, men too, who are just trying to live their lives. So every day of delay is too many lives lost. So as important as that case is, I don't think it can reach what we are seeing right now, and a application for precautionary measures regarding the failure and the duty to prevent genocide is something that might have some more immediate effect.
I would just like to highlight the sense of urgency with regards to the need to deploy and apply these legal tools, because at the end of the day, and while I mourn losing friends and neighbors and relatives, and I fear for the very safety of my own family, my parents and siblings are in Gaza. The tanks are 10 or 15 minutes away from where they are. I'm also aware that Gaza isn't in a vacuum. Gaza exists in a broader region, and it's part of our world. And the longer this genocide lasts, we will be risking further instability and further destabilization of the region, and we don't know what kind of consequences will unfold as a result of what's happening in Gaza. And this is important, and this is where accountability matters. We are here because of the lack of accountability for decades, and the international community must finally grapple with this fact that accountability is needed, and it's essential to prevent further aggression and bloodshed and destruction of Palestinian life, but also to ensure that that the future of the region isn't controlled by rogue states and leaders and politicians who think they can get away with crimes of genocide and killing people in mass and destroying societies and turning cities into piles of rubble. So I think this is very important. This is a moment of truth for the international community, for players in the region to do something about this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jehad and Katherine, for your views. I think we still have time for one or two additional questions, and I see one over there. And if there is anyone who would also like to, ask questions or raise their view, please. So, please, sir, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Allow me to harness the multilingualism available in our meeting. I'm a counsellor at the Ghanaian mission to the United Nations. I have one concern. After listening to the eminent panelists here at this meeting, a few days ago, the Israeli Prime Minister declared the following. His country is pursuing a very clear objective, that is to definitively wipe out Hamas. In your view, is this aim achievable so that this conflict can come to an end? My second concern is as follows. After having heard from the eminent personalities at this roundtable event, in your view, how long will this conflict go on? We've already started talking about genocide related to this conflict. How long will this conflict last? Next, what do you think about how Israel is reaching its main aim? Because in my view, I think that currently we're in a situation, as you've very well described, the population of Gaza is suffering in all of the worst forms of suffering. How long will this conflict go on? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. And I think perhaps I could firstly invite Jehad to respond to those questions. Please, thanks.
Thank you so much for this important question. On Saturday, the New York Times published a piece, and I quote with the title, and I quote, "Israel has yet to kill Hamas's top leaders, free all hostages, or offer convincing evidence that it can defeat Hamas without further devastation." End quote. This piece that ran in an outlet like the New York Times reflects how this question is now being asked by many experts and analysts around the world, but especially in the West and especially in outlets like the New York Times that is sympathetic towards Israel. And it's been more than 60 days, and as this piece mentions, Israel is yet to show an evidence of major strategic accomplishments in the battlefield or in terms of its declared goal of destroying Hamas, which is not something that we don't know how Israel aims at measuring achieving this goal and what it means for it to realize it. What we have seen so far is a large-scale campaign of bombardment and killing, the destruction of the foundations of society in Gaza, without really Israel demonstrating that it's on a path to achieve its declared military goals. And this is dangerous because the more Israel fails at achieving its declared military goals, the more harm it will inflict on the civilian population. Unfortunately for Palestinians, with Western backing, especially from the United States, Israel is capable of receiving the political cover and armed support in terms of weapons, shells and rockets and so on and so forth. And this is dangerous because this means that the war can continue perhaps for 2 or 3, maybe more than 3 months. But this will mean that the civilian price will be very heavy. And at the end of the day, my concern as someone who has family in Gaza is that in 2 months from now or in a month from now, the international community and especially Israel's allies will come to the realization that a military solution in Gaza is not tenable, and that they will go back and work through the mediators on some sort of an arrangement to free the hostages and to achieve a ceasefire. But after what price? Are we talking about 20,000 more Palestinians dead? Are we talking about the destruction of the remaining 20% parts of Gaza that remained intact and haven't been bombed? So I think if this continues for a few more weeks with the kinds of difficulties that are faced by people on the ground who are starving or are on the verge of starvation, I think then that the intent is not the destruction of Hamas, whatever that means. I think Israel is seizing an opportunity, given the level of Western support, to achieve a project of ethnic cleansing, of pushing Palestinians to Egypt. and then making this the international community's problem to deal with. So I think we need to really take Israel's cynicism, lack of accountability, and impunity into account and ask difficult questions like this. And I really thank you for your question again. And I'm happy to answer any additional questions on this matter.
Thank you very much, Jehad. And of course, our thoughts and prayers are with your family in Gaza and with all the civilians, all the women and children of Gaza. And I wish to invite if any other speakers would like to add their views on this question. Please. Yeah, then you.
I think that, you know, if I understood correctly, you used the word conflict. And I think we should shift and talk in the language of state violence, right? We should be talking about the reality unfolding in front of our eyes. This is not a conflict in the way that we think about it, right? This is a case of a genocidal assault that's rooted in decades and decades of state violence since the 1948 Nakba and until today. We also know when you look at this history that a military solution is not going to work, even if that's what you're advocating for, right? This is not going to work in the sense it's not going to bring security to Israelis, right? When we think about the larger context, the historical context that you, Jehad, laid out in detail, what will work is coming to terms with the truth about state violence since 1948 until today, right? What will work is advocating in whatever political form and shape it will take, right, an arrangement that will be based on equality, not the 2018 Jewish nation-state law that is explicitly discriminatory, right? What will work is an arrangement that will be based on the fact that security for Israelis depends on security for Palestinians, and security for Palestinians depends on security for Israelis, right? What will work is an arrangement that is based on the recognition of dignity for everyone who lives between the river and the sea, and the stopping of decades and decades of dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli media, culture, and society. This did not begin on 7th of October, describing Palestinians as human animals, as monsters, as Nazis, right? So we shouldn't be talking in the language of conflict. We should be describing what's unfolding in front of our eyes. We should be talking in the language of state violence. And if we think what will work is finally coming to terms with the truth.
Very little left to say after both of those interventions. Agree wholeheartedly. And I was just going to add about we must end the occupation, we must end the blockade, we must end the apartheid state. But going back to the first question, I think we must truly continue to interrogate the premise of that question, that this is the aim of wiping out Hamas. I think what we've laid out on this panel today is that the campaign of violence that we've seen over the last 2 months is not aimed at Hamas. It is aimed at the 2.3 million Palestinians in the occupied, besieged Gaza Strip. So this is not aimed at Hamas. That would look very different. This is a campaign aimed at the Palestinian civilian population. And so that is what must be ended. And it is really, I would suggest respectfully, within the power of states to make that happen more than it is even us. We can be on the streets, and I think we will continue to see activism on the streets across and around the world. We will take our case to the courts, but we need to see action here at the United Nations by all states. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there any other colleague who wishes to take the floor? I see none. And I would like to offer this opportunity to our speakers if they want to add some concluding thoughts before we wrap up our discussion. Any other additional concluding thoughts? All right. In that case, colleagues, excellencies, once again, I wish to thank all of you, all the speakers, all the participants for your presence here in our discussion. Our discussion today is entitled "The Responsibility to Prevent Genocide," but sadly, it's clear that genocide is already happening. So our question now is the responsibility to stop the ongoing genocide. And during our discussion, if I could just summarize some of the points raised during this discussion, that what's unfolding in Gaza at the moment is not an isolated incident. It's part of decades of systemic abuse by Israel against the Palestinian people, of what can be described as state violence that is further enabled by impunity. We are also reminded that even though the focus now is on Gaza, understandably, but widespread and systemic violations are also faced by Palestinians in other parts of the occupied territories in the West Bank. We've been reminded that all states have obligation to prevent and stop genocide, that national mechanism can be instrumental in supporting the plight of the Palestinian people, that the role of states and universal jurisdiction are important in ending impunity regarding the crime of genocide, and the urgency to act now before more and more innocent civilians become victim. Sadly, as of now, more than 1% of the civilian population in Gaza have become victims, fatalities of this tragedy, and then it's time for all of us to act, to choose the right thing, to uphold humanity. So again, I wish to thank all panelists for a very rich exchanges on international law, on ongoing situation, on the responsibility of states, on other issues, and in this regard, the committee will of course continue to call for the application of international human rights and international humanitarian law without exception, or for ensuring that civilians are never targeted. Member states should reflect on the topics discussed today, including on what are the elements that constitute the crime of genocide under the international law, how the obligation to prevent genocide applies to the current situation in Gaza, as well as what is the potential outreach to the mandated judicial body. The committee supports the Secretary General for invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, calling on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities and ensure the implementation of its resolution 2712/2023. We also second the call for the protection of civilians and an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The committee regrets the failure of the Security Council last Friday to adopt a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. We appeal to the Security Council to find ways to stop this war immediately. The onus now is with the General Assembly, who will hold an emergency special session yet again this afternoon. And we invite all the members and observers of the committee, and in fact all member states of the United Nations, to stand up not only for Palestine, but for humanity. Before we close, let me remind you that a recording of this meeting will be posted on the website of the committee at the following address, www.un.org/unispal. And I also wish to once again thanks the interpreters who have joined us today and made interpretation possible. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks.